Welcome to the Peculiar History Channel. For the next, however long it takes, I will be attempting to list 7 facts about every single U.S. president in history. Starting with part 1, George Washington. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, on his family's plantation in Westmoreland, Virginia. But did you know that he was actually born on February 11th, 1731? Wait, that's confusing. Well, you see, it really depends on what calendar you decide to follow. At the time of his birth, he was officially born on February 11th, 1731, but only because Washington's family followed what was then known as the Julian calendar. The American colonies did officially follow this calendar up until 1752. In 1752, the Gregorian calendar was introduced by England and was instilled in all of its colonies. After the switch, Washington's birthday was changed 1 year and 11 days to February 22nd, 1732. Fact number 2. It's common knowledge that Washington served in the British military in his younger years. However, George's time serving was a brutal one, suffering from multiple near-death experiences while serving. During the Battle of Monongahela, George Washington had 2 horses shot out from underneath him, and his coat was blasted with bullet holes after the battle. Miraculously, though, Washington was not struck, not even once. Another time, Washington nearly drowned in the Allegheny River in what is now current-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was crossing over the river on a quote-unquote makeshift raft, and he slipped in. He was pulled out of the water and rescued by his companion at the time, Christopher Gist. Fact number 3. Another piece of common knowledge was that Washington's teeth were made out of wood. But were they really? Despite Washington's impressive strength and stature, his one weakness could without a doubt be considered the inside of his mouth. Washington regularly wrote in his diary about his toothaches, inflamed gums, and kept record of his payments to his dentists. George Washington did wear dentures, but the fact of the matter is, they were not made of wood. George Washington used mostly other creatures' teeth to replace his own. Human teeth, horse teeth, cow teeth, elephant teeth, and some good old-fashioned brass and metal. Until 1782, George Washington kept all of his pulled teeth in a locked cabinet in his Mount Vernon estate, with the hope that he could someday use them to make a pair of dentures that would fit his mouth perfectly, as the dentures he was forced to use made him a tad bit self-conscious. He would sometimes have very little desire to speak, especially in his later years, due to his oversized and uncomfortable dentures. Not to mention, he was not a fan of how the dentures made him look, claiming that they caused his lips to be enlarged and his jaw to be widened. Both features that George Washington hated about himself. Fact number 4. George Washington owned slaves. A lot of slaves. At the time of his death, his estate at Mount Vernon was occupied by over 300 slaves. About 100 of them were directly owned by George Washington himself. Also worth noting is that George Washington inherited slaves from his father, which just sounds so wrong. And he also inherited 2,000 acres of plantation land at Mount Vernon, Virginia, after his brother passed away. Maybe it was just me, but growing up, I was always taught a very specific image of George Washington. It came from a lowly background, hard-working, rags-to-riches kind of guy. That's at least the vibe I always felt when I was learning about him. Come to find out, though, he really only became ultra-wealthy because of his marriage to Martha. Which brings us to fact number 5, which is that Martha Washington, born Martha Dandridge in 1731, was the oldest of 8 children. Her first marriage was to a man named Daniel Parke Custis, one of the wealthiest plantation owners in Virginia, like literally a millionaire in the 1740s. Also worth mentioning that she was only 19 and Custis was 40, but then again, this is a point in history where the elite actually owned humans, so yeah, standards are low. And own humans they did. Daniel Custis was the owner of over 300 slaves and 17,000 acres of tobacco plantation. He had so much money that he even had house slaves. Yes, that was the rich guy standard at the time. If you could afford to have enough slaves to do the household chores, you were considered the elite of the elite. Martha moved into the Custis estate in New Kent County, Virginia. The name of the Custis estate was coincidentally named White House and was nestled within the 17,000 acres of land in which Custis owned. In 1757, Custis died, unexpectedly and maybe spectacularly. We don't know much about it, but nonetheless, he was no longer breathing, and so all of his fortune and plantation land was left to the newly widowed Martha Custis. She would only remain Martha Custis, though, for 2 more years, when on January 6, 1759, she would be remarried. Look, it's not entirely confirmed that George Washington pursued her for the sole purpose of money. However, let's just say it was absolutely common knowledge in the area at the time that there was a very wealthy, young widow living up in the White House who has a strong desire to increase the size of her family. In particular, the number of children she had. I'm sure these were not deal breakers for young Mr. Washington. It may shock you to hear that prenups were in full force at the time and actually was to be expected from Martha to give to George. However, she trusted George so much that she didn't find it necessary. And so just like that, Martha Custis becomes Martha Washington. Fact number 6. The reason presidents of the United States are only allowed to serve 2 full 4-year terms as president is because of George Washington. And not even because he was being punished at the time. As a matter of fact, almost every executive and official in the newly founded colonies at the time wanted George to serve more than 2 terms. It was George himself, though, that would object to this notion. George felt that as a growing and thriving young republic, it was important that its leaders show integrity and honor by willingly stepping down and allowing the next generation of leaders to see that the country heads in the correct direction. And so after 2 terms in office, George stepped down, creating what is one of the longest-standing traditions in American history. And to this day, the only president ever to serve more than 2 terms is Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Fact number 7. George Washington actually never served in Washington, D.C., and never lived in the White House, mainly because Washington, D.C. did not exist for most of George's presidency. He instead lived in New York City, which was the capital of the United States until 1790, when the capital was changed to Philadelphia, at which time he promptly moved to Philadelphia. You see, Washington, D.C. was officially established in 1790 and was named after George Washington himself. The name D.C., meaning District of Columbia, was heavily inspired by Christopher Columbus, who was seen as a real swell guy in these times. D.C., however, was not made the capital of the United States until after George had died in 1800. George Washington also never lived in the White House, as its construction was not completed until, again, after George's death. George Washington remains the only president in history to never live and operate from the White House. Also a bonus fact, the White House was originally referred to as the, quote, presidential palace, but that must not have had the same ring.